This conference will now be recorded.
Hello. Today I'm going to talk about employee surveys. So internally within HR, they're referred to as engagement surveys. So how that process starts is you'll normally receive an email that looks a lot like this one. So it'll say, "Dear employee, we invite you to participate in a 2019 engagement survey. The short survey consists of a few questions. Please provide your honest feedback as it will help us to know the areas where we can improve. To complete this confidential survey, simply click the link provided below, and you'll automatically be taken to the online survey. The survey will be available for completion, and they'll give you a time frame, and it'll take approximately 10 minutes to complete. A link can only be used once to submit a survey, so please do not share your invitation with someone else. If you encounter issues completing the survey, or if you have any questions, please reach out to, normally it's someone in HR, whoever's the administrator of that survey. And then this piece here is key, right? Click here to complete your survey. So let's start off with kind of behind the scenes. So I used to build the surveys a lot, and there's a lot of money that goes into building the perfect survey, from the questions, how the questions are framed, how you write your questions. This gives employers a lot of insight into you, the employee. And companies spend, I think, millions annually trying to understand you as an employee, but there's kind of a larger picture where our data is being used in ways that we don't even realize it, right? And sometimes we realize it, but we're naive to the effects of it. So let's start off with building the perfect survey, the question types. So the question types will be either multiple choice, it might be a drop down. A lot of companies like to use the Likert scale just because it allows you to either strongly agree, strongly disagree. And I think over the last couple of years, most companies have gone with that option because it avoids kind of free text and doesn't allow people to put too much, right? It's either you agree, most people are going to come up somewhere in the middle where they're neutral. Also allows for matrix questions, and those are questions that are essentially grouped together. Open-ended text questions, and I touched on that a little bit, but most of the times they'll limit that, and I'll talk about the reasons why they'll limit open-ended text questions. They do love slider scales, and in the last couple of years, there's a big push around NPS, or Net Promoter Scores. And what this does is it collects and segments your responses, so on a 0 to 10-point scale, and it highlights who they consider to be promoters, who are employees that are passive, and then who are the employees that are detractors. Detractors has an asterisk because if you think about it, some detractors that are labeled as detractors are not. Sometimes there are people that genuinely care about the company, so they're providing honest feedback with the naive intent that the survey is, one, confidential, and two, that it'll be used for a positive reason. And that's not the case. What happens is they tend to be honest, and then they're labeled as a detractor. If they put any type of negative feedback in that survey, there's configuration that allows the system or administrator to instantly send an email, whether it's to human resources, employee relations, whoever's responsible for managing that portion, to make them aware that they need to take an employee action against that employee/detractor. So the question is, if it's in a survey that you're completing anonymously and it's confidential, how are they knowing who are detractors, passives, and or promoters? And we'll get to that as we kind of talk through the additional pieces that goes into building the survey. So there's validation that happens. So as I build out the question that employees have to fill out, I can select whether or not I want a question to be required. I can select validation that happens behind the scenes. So if I ask you a very, very specific question, like on a scale of 1 to 10, and let's say you have to select 5 and there's no other response, but you select 6, that survey will not allow you to go ahead because there's logic built in that says it's an invalid response. I can limit how many answers you can select for a question, and then there's character limitations. The character limitations ties more to free text. A lot of companies will use this, especially when the culture is bad, right? If they've had a lot of changes in the organization, if they've had a layoff. I don't want you going in that survey and writing a dissertation, so I'm going to limit that character limitation to maybe 100 characters so that you have to keep your responses short. I can show or hide specific answers based on logic. So if you are in a certain department and I don't want you to see questions, I can limit that. And again, if we're talking about confidentiality, how can the logic know who's in which group and who to bypass? Email validation is a big one. A lot of times they'll ask you to self-identify by entering your email address. I think that's kind of email 101 and the tracking that goes into that. There's no way that you're entering your email address on a survey and anyone can look you in the eyes and say, hey, this is confidential, because it's not. And then there's a redirect. So when that survey is completed, 9 out of 10 times, most companies have you directed to a landing page, and it's always their choice. A lot of times that landing page is the company's intranet. A lot of times some companies use SharePoint, so it'll bring you back to that internal landing page. And there is a reason for this. A lot of times if you hit that landing page, you're on your work computer that they own that has a very specific identifier that says John Smith owns this Lenovo or Dell model computer. His IP address is XYZ. It's very, very intentional why they do the things that they do. Another thing is just building out the security. So as an administrator in the past, I would have the capability to activate and deactivate surveys. So if you think about confidentiality, if let's say it's a smaller company, and I've traditionally worked for large organizations, but if it's a small company and let's say there's 30 people in the company, and I say I'm going to activate finance for 2 days, HR for 5 days, and then maybe operations for another 2 days. And again, we're talking about 30 people. So if there's only 2 people in finance and I only get 1 response or vice versa, it's not hard for them to figure out who did what and during what time. A lot of passwords are also password protected. The thing about the password protection that people don't understand is I have to give you a unique password. That password is unique to you, the user. So no 2 employees are going to have the same password. How do I, the administrator, know which password is designated for you versus the other person unless it's not confidential? There's multiple submissions. And what this is, a lot of times in the industry, they call it anti-ballot stuffing. And this basically blocks the same respondent from submitting a survey multiple times. And eons ago, before they started doing the multiple submissions or anti-ballot stuffing, I had an employee that literally completed the survey 5 different times. He wrote differently each time, had spelling and grammatical errors on one, just to try to throw people. Not realizing even then, as long ago as that was, there was still technology in place to know that he was the one that filled it out. But the purpose of that is really just to cut back on allowing that to even happen. There's assurance for the purpose is really to be anonymous. And what happens with this, and I'm just being completely transparent, and I think every HR person or every ops person that's responsible for doing surveys is going to hate me. The reality is it's an extra fee. I've never, ever, and I'm not being sarcastic, I've never, ever seen an employer pay this fee. And the reason is because it doesn't make sense. What they'll assert is that the system administrator won't have access to the respondent's email address as well as the response data. However, and this is why they don't waste the money paying for it, there's still a computer-generated ID for individuals that complete the survey. So even if I'm saying, okay, I don't want a particular administrator to have access to it, there's still someone at the vendor site who can determine which employee completed that survey. Then there's single sign-on, and single sign-on basically allows an employer to authenticate you. So if you work on different systems throughout the day, you might be able to jump from one system to the next system without entering your username and password, so you're not having to authenticate each time. That's the purpose of single sign-on. So a lot of times they'll use single sign-on for the surveys, and basically that authenticates you as a legitimate user, and then it just brings you directly to the survey. It's seamless. You don't notice it, just like you don't notice it when you utilize it throughout the day. The only time that it probably wouldn't be seamless or noticeable is if you didn't successfully authenticate, and it'll prompt you to enter your username and password. Additionally, there's the live URL, which I think it's just common sense. Every website that we access throughout the day, there's a ton of data analytics around it. I'm also a small business owner, so one of the things that I'm able to do is go in and see how many site visitors I had on a particular day. I can drill down and see exactly which state, and I can even drill down to see which city, demographics for that person. So the amount of data, again, it's really, really scary. That email, when we talk about that initial email that you receive that tells you it's confidential, that email will probably have tags in it. And basically, with tags, it just makes tracking easier. So there's tracking that is utilized. They want to be able to see, okay, was the survey viewed? Did so-and-so complete the survey? And then, of course, there's email notifications. So just think about it again. If it's confidential, somewhere, somehow, there's logic that says 50 employees did not complete the survey, so send them email reminders, and I would be able to set the trigger. So I'm one of those people that's a little bit more aggressive, so I would set that email notification to notify you every 3 days that I'm waiting for you to complete this survey. And then for those that did complete the survey, I would send out those thank you emails. And again, email 101, we know that there's tracking behind that. There's also an address import or data load, and this just basically allows them to have online access for tracking survey respondents. So a lot of times that initial data load will be first name, last name, your employee ID, your employee email address, your employee work site. A lot of times it might include username, password, depending on what they need. But there's a ton of information that gets uploaded into that vendor system so that they're able to track survey respondents. So if I'm tracking you, how is it confidential? And then reports. So as administrator, I had accessibility to everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything, down to survey responses, and everything was collected in real time. So if I wanted to download a standard report, I would go into the system. I would have the capability to do kind of a trend analysis. So I'd be able to see, I don't know, let's say the certain group is unhappy. I could paint a picture and just look at the data there to see, okay, well, HR is really, really happy right now. Why are they unhappy? And okay, let's drill down a little bit more. Compensation is a big issue, right? So there's a lot of trend analysis that occurs. There's dashboards available normally for executive leadership to go in and do drill downs. A lot of times they honestly don't care unless it's something bad. And it's not so much that they're caring to address it. It's how do I stifle it? But in this specific case, when it comes to like data analytics, I would have to provide weekly reports A lot of the weekly reports was really just counts, who started, who finished, who just viewed the survey. And week after week, you would keep sending that until you got to around a 90% completion rate. Most companies will have you stop at 95 because that's successful. And then that would be not considered complete. They'll always try to push up until that last hour, but that occurs. Report distribution. So in a previous role, I worked in a company where I would literally have to send those responses. It was a comprehensive report to everyone. So if you were a manager and you had even one employee reporting to you, I would have to send you the full survey results. So you had access to everything across the company. Over the years, a lot of companies have gotten better about that, and they are a little bit more controlled. Some companies will lock it down, so only directors and above will have access. Some companies are very, very particular, where they'll limit it just to their executive leadership team, which is kind of funny because most of the times the executive leadership team doesn't do anything. So it's probably their admin that goes in and does that that drill down and additional work. So there's interactive map responses. So this technology has definitely gotten better over the years just because it allows you to see responses using an interactive map. I was able to see which states had better completion rates. One company was in retail, so if I wanted to see, Michigan, I could drill down and see, okay, well, 85% of the people in Michigan completed the survey, whereas 25% of the people in New York completed it. And then there's different things that happen behind the scenes, different discussions just to try to understand variances and why people are not completing it. The next one is Response Editor. So this one I don't really like to tell people about, but you can validate and make sure that what I'm telling you is factual. Response Editor would basically allow me to go in, and as the administrator, I could delete certain responses. So there's some companies, they'll have internal guidelines around deleting responses, but there's some companies where they do not police it. So let's just say I work in HR. I'm an administrator that's responsible for the survey, and there's a ton of negative responses coming through about HR. Separate from that, a person writes in and they say very, very specific thing about a specific person in HR that I'm friends with. There's nothing that prevents me from going in and deleting that respondent's responses. Nothing. There's also heat map technology that they use, so this allows them to collect the exact coordinates of a respondent. So I don't have to talk to you about coordinates. I think everyone knows how that works. Same thing kind of goes with geocoding. So geocoding, each response is coded with your location based on your IP mapping. And again, most of us are completing the survey at work anyways, so just let that really, really sink in because you're using their computer that they've assigned to you. And again, they know your IP address. So for me, I love data, and employers spend a ton of money annually just trying to understand how you think and how they use that data. I can tell you 9 out of 10, and I'm not being sarcastic, most employers collect these responses year after year and they do absolutely nothing with it. They collect it for the sake of saying they collect it. There's maybe that 1% that actually collects the responses and actually takes actions based on it. I don't think that it serves any benefit for you, the employee, to complete the survey, especially if things are not going well and you provide feedback at that they decide to label you as a detractor, and you're not being a detractor, you're just really trying to provide them with good feedback. And I think that just ties to kind of no good deed goes unpunished. So personally, I don't recommend completing it. If you do complete it, and it's one of those things where they're nagging you or it's a required survey, use the sliding scales. not encouraging anyone to lie, but just try to avoid anything that will make you look like a detractor. Definitely avoid free text, just because a lot of times they already know who types a certain way. If you're not someone with good spelling and grammar, it's easy to pinpoint who wrote what. And funny story, because I actually worked in a department where two people submitted very similar survey results, and this was before we had some of the technology we do now. And there was a lot of guessing and trying to figure out, okay, who wrote what response. And they actually were close. They were able to identify the two. They just kind of flip flopped their responses. But I would definitely just be really, really cautious about writing too much. If it's something where you think someone is in danger of being hurt, then that's a different story. And I also actually encountered where an employee submitted a threat via the survey. He actually threatened to do bodily harm to several employees. So we had to do some tracking to figure out who that was, and that was quickly mitigated. So I think that's kind of common sense. Don't make any threats, and definitely just don't say anything that's going to adversely impact your career. So for everything that I covered today, I just want to thank you for your time. I do think that I provided adequate information, but I encourage you to go out, validate all of the information that I shared with you, the heat map, geocoding, everything. Just validate, make sure, it's good to trust what I'm saying, but it's also important that you validate and understand it for yourself. And you'll find that when it comes to technology, there's a lot of scary things happening. We're kind of not paying attention. We're just going through the motions. You might want a toaster. You Google it, and then all of a sudden you're getting 1,000 ads for that toaster. A lot of retail stores in particular are working on tech where they want to be able to ping your phone, and the second you walk through those doors, they want to be able to send you a coupon. There's some people that argue that the way that they're utilizing our data is invasive and it breaches privacy. But I think it's important for us as people to do our research, truly understand what is happening around us. But again, I just strongly, strongly, strongly recommend if you do complete that survey, keep it very, very brief. Thank you, and I hope you join my next video, which will be talking about the equal opportunity, or specifically the EEOC, whether or not they're helpful or not. So thank you for your time, and have a great day. Bye.